Her own mother sold Obese daughter to strangers. For $5, Mountain Man herded and paid $100. $5 for the fat one, the woman snarled, jerking a frayed rope like she was haggling over a hog and not her own blood. Blackwater's spring market didn't pause. Men bartered over whiskey and bullets while Mildred Hargrave dragged her daughter through the dust toward a plank counter behind the saloon. Lenora's wrists were roped raw. Her cotton dress, let down twice and mended 5 times, strained at the seams as the crowd closed in with the boozy curiosity of vultures. Someone laughed. Someone else spat. The barkeep rang a bell for bets, and another round. $5, Mildred repeated, lifting her chin like a queen with nothing left but cruelty. She eats twice, works half, and cries all the time. Take her off my hands. Lenora's mouth trembled. Mama, please. The word cracked in the dry air. A backhand cut it short. Dust stuck to the tear shining on her cheek. A scar-stitched drifter sauntered forward, jangling coins. $2, he smirked, pinching Lenora's chin, turning her like a side of beef. Maybe I sell her south if she won't scrub. Laughter rose, rough and eager. Lenora flinched from the hand, not from the insult. You could see the training in the flinch, the practiced way a soul learns to become small when the world grows mean. Her gaze skittered past faces that looked everywhere, but back at her like mirrors too honest to bear. The bell clanged again. Sold! The barkeep crowed, reaching to clap palms with the drifter. A new voice cut the noise clean. 100. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The word landed heavy as an anvil, and every head turned toward the shadow pooling under the cut roof of the livery. He stepped into the light, broad shoulders under a storm-dark duster, beard black as coal seam, eyes the winter blue of river ice. Tobias Blackthorne had the look of a man the mountains build and the towns fear, quiet, scarred, and undecorated by anyone's approval. He set a leather poke on the counter. Gold clinked. 100 to buy her out of a mother who forgot what the word means. The crowd went silent in that particular way crowds do when shame is suddenly present. The drifter cleared his throat and drifted backward. Mildred's smile snapped on like a trap. Cash is cash. Tobias didn't touch the rope. He lifted Lenora's hands, gentle as a parson turning pages, slid his knife beneath the knot, and freed her wrists. Then, without ceremony, he shrugged off his coat and set it across her shoulders. She blinked into the wool, into the first warmth of the day that wasn't sun. He looked at Mildred just once. "There's a difference between poor and wicked," he said, voice low enough to make the boards listen. "You chose the wrong one." He turned, guiding Lenora through the stunned corridor of onlookers. Somewhere a stallion snorted. Somewhere a child stopped laughing. Behind them, gold clinked again as the barkeep counted it twice, as if counting might make the moment less true. At the street's edge, Lenora hesitated, eyes wide, as if the open world were another kind of gallows. Tobias tipped his head toward the waiting horse. "You're leaving now," he said, "on your own 2 feet if you want. No one's pulling you anywhere again." The road out of Blackwater wound between cliffs the color of old bone. By noon, the noise of the market had faded behind them, replaced by the hush of wind and the steady rhythm of hooves. Lenora sat sideways behind Tobias on the great black horse, her fingers gripping the worn leather of the saddle. The coat he'd draped over her shoulders still carried the scent of pine smoke and iron. She hadn't spoken since they left the town gates. Tobias didn't push her. He rode the way a man breathes, slow, steady, deliberate. When they reached a ridge overlooking the valley, he finally spoke. "There's a stream down there. We'll rest." Lenora slid off the horse with awkward heaviness. Her legs gave way after only a few steps, and she nearly fell. Tobias caught her arm, firm, not rough, and steadied her until she found her balance. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded toward the stream. "Sit. You've been through hell. Let's wash it off before we keep walking." Lenora knelt by the water. The reflection that met her was swollen-eyed and smeared with dirt, a stranger shaped like shame. She cupped water to her face until her skin burned from the cold. Behind her, Tobias unsaddled his horse and set a small fire. He moved with the quiet competence of a man who had no one left to impress. Every motion was clean and necessary, no wasted effort, no pride. When he handed her a tin cup of water, she took it with trembling fingers. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Why pay that much for someone like me?" Tobias's eyes stayed on the flames. "Because no one else would." "That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters." She wanted to press him, but his tone left no room. They ate in silence, strips of dried venison, a heel of bread. It was more than she'd had in days. When she finished, she murmured, "My mother, she wasn't always like that. Or maybe I was too small to notice when she changed." Tobias leaned back against a rock, arms crossed. People don't turn cruel overnight. They just stop fighting the part of themselves that already was. Lenora stared into the fire. "She said I ruined her life, that no man would have her because of me. Then she was weaker than she looked." His words weren't gentle, but they were true. And for the first time, the truth didn't hurt as much as the lies she'd grown up hearing. When the fire burned low, Tobias rose. "We'll reach my cabin by tomorrow. There's shelter, food, a roof that doesn't leak. You'll rest there a few days, then I'll take you to another town if you wish." Lenora's stomach tightened. "You'll just let me go?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because you deserve to decide something for yourself." The simplicity of it stole her breath. All her life, decisions had been made for her. What to eat, what to wear, what she was worth. She didn't know what to do with freedom now that it stood quietly in front of her. That night, Tobias slept on one side of the fire, his rifle across his knees. Lenora lay wrapped in his coat on the other, pretending to sleep. She watched the flames reflect in his eyes until exhaustion finally pulled her under. Dawn rose pale and cold. Tobias was already up, tending the horse. When he saw her stir, he handed her a piece of hardtack and a strip of smoked meat. "We ride hard today," he said. "The trail's narrow and mean. Stay close." They climbed higher into the mountains, where the air thinned and the snow still lingered in patches. Lenora's body ached, but something inside her began to unknot, a fragile thread of trust pulling taut instead of breaking. At midday, they crossed a wooden bridge above a rushing gorge. Below, the water shimmered like steel. Tobias led the horse with one hand, his other outstretched to steady her. "You afraid of heights?" he asked. She swallowed. "Only of falling." "That's everyone's fear. Just don't look down." She followed his voice across the boards, step by trembling step. When they reached the other side, Tobias gave a small nod. "See? Not so bad." For the first time she smiled, a shy, uncertain thing, but real. "You sound like you've done this before." "Fallen?" more times than I can count. He said it with such dry humor that she laughed, the sound startling both of them. Tobias glanced over, the corner of his mouth twitching, then turned away as if embarrassed by his own reaction. By the time dusk painted the sky, they reached a slope dotted with pines. Tobias pointed toward the distant ridge where smoke curled faintly. "There," he said, "home." The word hit Lenora like warmth after a lifetime of winter. As they rode the final mile, she whispered, almost to herself, "No one's ever come back for me before?" Tobias's voice was quiet. "Then it's about damn time someone did." The last light bled over the mountains, turning the snow gold. The cabin waited. Dark wood, sturdy walls, and the promise of a peace she'd never known. The wind sharpened as the trail climbed higher. Pines closed in around them, whispering secrets through their needles. Every so often, Tobias would glance back to make sure Lenora was still behind him, her figure small but determined against the slope. They rode in silence most of the morning. Words felt too fragile for the world they were moving through, a world of wind, stone, and distance. But silence with Tobias wasn't heavy. It was safe. When the clouds broke, sunlight spilled across the peaks. Tobias pointed ahead. "That ridge up there, once we cross it, we're half a day from the cabin." Lenora nodded, her cheeks red from cold. "It's beautiful," she murmured. He followed her gaze, and for the first time in years looked at the mountains as something more than shelter. "It is," he admitted, "if you can stand the loneliness." She hesitated before asking, "And you can?" He didn't answer right away. "You learn to. Then one day, you forget you ever wanted anything else." There was sadness in the words, the kind that comes from making peace with pain rather than escaping it. By late afternoon, clouds gathered again. The first flakes of snow began to fall, swirling like ashes. Tobias quickened the pace. "We'll camp before the pass. The storm's rolling in faster than I thought." They found shelter beneath a rocky overhang. Tobias tethered the horse, built a small fire, and handed Lenora his canteen. "Drink. You're pale." She obeyed, though her hands trembled. Her dress was thin, her fingers already blue. Without a word, Tobias pulled another blanket from his saddlebag and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. He sat opposite her, feeding twigs into the fire. "You don't have to thank me every time." "Old habits," she said softly. "When you grow up owing people for their patience, you learn to say it often." His jaw tightened. No one should owe another person for being decent. Lenora studied his face in the flickering light. Beneath the scars, she saw not a monster, but a man who had been broken and welded back together by something fierce, maybe grief, maybe guilt. She didn't ask which. The snow thickened outside. Tobias passed her a tin bowl of stew, meat, onions, and herbs, rich and steaming. She tasted it carefully, then smiled. "It's good." "Better than the saloon's cooking?" he asked dryly. She gave a soft laugh. "Anything is." When she'd eaten half, he nodded toward the bowl. "Finish it." "I can't take the rest. You need it too." "I've had worse winters than this," he said. "Eat." It wasn't a command. It was care disguised as gruffness. Lenora obeyed, and warmth spread through her body for the first time in weeks. Night deepened. Tobias banked the fire and spread his bedroll a few feet away. "Get some rest. The snow should pass by morning." Lenora lay awake long after he closed his eyes. The wind howled through the rocks, but the fire's glow held steady. She listened to his steady breathing and wondered what kind of life had made a man like him, one who fought like a bear but spoke with the gentleness of someone afraid to break what little good remained in the world. She thought of her mother's voice, sharp and cold as a knife. "No one will ever want you." And then she looked at Tobias, asleep by the fire, his face softened in the glow, and felt that lie begin to loosen its grip. At dawn, the world was white and silent. Snow covered everything except the dark shape of Tobias's coat draped over her shoulders. He was already awake, melting snow in a pot for water. "Morning," he said, glancing at her. "Morning," she answered, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Eat something before we ride." She smiled faintly. "You always sound like you're giving orders." He raised a brow. "You always sound like you're surprised someone cares whether you eat." That made her laugh, the first clear sound of joy since he'd found her. Tobias froze, startled, then looked away quickly as if embarrassed by the warmth that rose in him. They packed and mounted up. The snow crunched beneath the horses' hooves as they began the final ascent toward the ridge. By midday, they reached the pass. Below them stretched a valley so wide it seemed the sky had fallen and shattered into rivers and pine. In the far distance, a thin column of smoke marked the cabin. "There it is," Tobias said quietly. Lenora's breath caught. "You're home." "Our shelter," he corrected, "for now." They began the descent, careful on the icy path. Halfway down, the horse stumbled slightly. Lenora gasped and clutched Tobias's coat. He steadied the reins and turned his head just enough for his voice to reach her. "You're safe. I've got you." 3 words, simple as breath, but they sank deep, anchoring her in a way she hadn't felt in years. They reached the valley floor by dusk. The cabin came into view. Solid logs, a stone chimney, smoke curling steady and blue. It wasn't large or fine, but it looked alive. Tobias dismounted first and helped Lenora down. "Inside," he said, opening the door. The warmth of the fire wrapped around her instantly. The air smelled of pine resin and old tobacco. Every surface, the shelves, the tools, the stacked firewood, told of a life built by one pair of hands. Lenora turned slowly, taking it all in. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's simple," Tobias replied, "but it keeps the world out." She looked at him, eyes shining. Maybe that's what beautiful really means. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled between them, and something fragile but steady began to form. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. 2 people who had both been thrown away, standing on the edge of a new beginning. Outside, snow began to fall again. Soft this time, not cruel. And for the first time in her life, Lenora didn't flinch at the sound of the wind. The first morning in the cabin smelled of coffee and pine smoke. Lenora woke to the hiss of a kettle and the rhythmic scrape of an axe outside. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then her eyes caught the rough-hewn beams above her, the folded blanket Tobias had left by the bed, and the realization washed through her like sunlight after rain. She was safe. She slipped from under the covers and stood by the window. Outside, Tobias split logs with steady precision, his movements deliberate, patient. Steam curled from his breath in the cold. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to speak to fill the air. Every action already said enough. When she stepped outside, he looked up briefly. "Coffee's ready," he said, nodding toward the kettle. "There's bread by the stove." She hesitated. "Can I help?" He paused, wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "You can start by eating." It wasn't a command. It was concern disguised as gruffness. Inside, the bread was still warm. Lenora broke off a piece and sat at the rough wooden table. Everything in the cabin spoke of solitude. 2 plates, a single chair carved a little uneven, tools hanging in perfect order, yet the space didn't feel lonely. It felt waiting. When Tobias came in, setting his axe aside, she poured him coffee without asking. He accepted it with a quiet nod. For a few minutes, they just sat across from each other while the wind sighed around the eaves. "You built this place yourself?" she asked finally. "Mostly," he said. "Had help once." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. But in that small pause, she sensed ghosts moving behind his eyes. Days found a rhythm. Tobias hunted, chopped wood, repaired fences. Lenora cleaned, cooked, and tended the small garden behind the cabin. At first, she moved like a guest afraid to touch anything. Soon, she moved like someone who belonged. When she scrubbed the table, Tobias repaired the roof above her. When she boiled potatoes, he fixed the latch on her door so it would close without noise. Neither of them spoke much, but every act was a kind of conversation. At dusk, they would share supper by the fire, stew thick with roots and meat, or corn cakes and beans. Afterward, Tobias would sit sharpening his knife while Lenora mended clothes. The silence between them softened into comfort. One evening, she said almost shyly, "I used to think quiet meant punishment." Tobias glanced up. "And now? Now it sounds like peace." He smiled faintly, a rare thing that transformed his whole face. "Then we'll keep it that way." The weeks passed. Spring crept slowly into the mountains. Lenora's body grew stronger. Her hands, once soft and hesitant, turned capable. Tobias showed her how to set snares, how to tell edible herbs from poisonous ones, how to read the sky before a storm. She listened carefully, eager to learn, and he found himself talking more than he had in years. Once, while teaching her to split wood, he placed his hands over hers to guide the axe. The touch was brief but steady. She felt the warmth of his skin, the weight of his patience, and her heartbeat stumbled. When she looked up, Tobias stepped back quickly, clearing his throat. "Keep your grip tight," he said. "The axe listens to confidence." She smiled. "I'll try to sound convincing." That night, lying in bed, she thought of his hands, how gentle they'd been for a man built of storms. Little by little, Lenora began to laugh again. She sang sometimes while cooking, off-key but cheerful. Tobias pretended not to notice, though the corners of his mouth betrayed him. He brought home wildflowers once, claiming they were for the table, but she caught the awkwardness in his voice and arranged them carefully in a jar anyway. One afternoon, she found an old fiddle in a chest under his bed, the strings dusty but intact. When she asked, he looked startled. "Used to play," he said, "a long time ago." "Play now," she urged gently. He hesitated, then sat by the fire and drew the bow across the strings. The sound was rough at first, then steadied into something aching and beautiful. Lenora closed her eyes. It felt like the mountains were singing through him. When he finished, she whispered, "That was lovely." He shrugged, embarrassed. "Cabin's too quiet sometimes." "Not any more," she said softly. As the snow melted, Lenora transformed the small patch behind the cabin into a garden. She planted potatoes, beans, and herbs. Tobias built her a fence to keep out rabbits. Each morning, she knelt in the soil humming, her skirts stained with earth. Tobias watched from the porch, pretending to whittle, though his gaze lingered longer than he meant it to. One evening, after rain, she brought him a bowl of stew and sat beside him on the porch. The valley shimmered below, washed clean. "Do you ever miss the world out there?" she asked. He shook his head. "Out there's where people forget their souls. And in here? In here you have to live with yours." She smiled faintly. "That's what I'm learning to do." He looked at her then, really looked, at the freckles the sun had drawn out, the steadiness in her eyes, the quiet strength that had replaced fear. "You're not the same woman I found in that market," he said. "I hope not," she whispered. "But I wouldn't be her if you hadn't stopped." Tobias turned his gaze back to the horizon. Maybe we both needed saving. That night, thunder rolled through the mountains. Lenora woke to the sound of wind battering the shutters. She lit a candle and found Tobias already up, securing the door. When the lightning flashed, she saw a shadow cross his face. Fear, not for himself, but for her. "It's just a storm," she said. He nodded, though his jaw was tight. "Last one like this took the roof before I rebuilt. Stay close to the hearth." When a crack of thunder shook the walls, she flinched. Tobias crossed the room and laid a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "No one's coming through that door." The words sank deep, steady as the pulse beneath his palm. She leaned slightly into the touch, and he didn't pull away. For a long time they sat like that, the fire between them, the storm outside, the quiet promise of something neither dared name. When the wind finally died, Tobias stood. "You should rest," he said, voice rougher than usual. Lenora nodded, eyes shining in the candlelight. "Good night, Tobias." He paused at the doorway. "Good night, Lenora." In the weeks that followed, the storm passed, but something had shifted. Their mornings began with shared laughter over burnt bread. Their evenings ended with stories and soft silences. Tobias carved her a comb from deer antler. She sewed him a new shirt from rough cotton she'd traded for in town. Neither gift was perfect, but both were cherished. One evening, as they watched the sunset bleed into the valley, Tobias said quietly, "Sometimes I forget the world ever hurt us." Lenora looked at him. "Maybe that's what healing feels like." He turned to meet her gaze. For once, there was no distance, no guardedness, just warmth, steady and undeniable. The fire crackled inside the cabin, the garden whispered outside, and between them stretched the fragile piece of two lives finally beginning again. Summer came early to the mountains that year. The snow melted fast and the rivers ran high, carrying whole trees downstream. Flowers bloomed on the slopes behind the cabin, and the air smelled of rain and resin. But with the thaw came visitors and rumors. It began when Tobias rode down to the nearest trading post for supplies. He hadn't been there in months, and his name still carried weight. Men greeted him with caution, women with curiosity. He ignored them all, as always, until he overheard a voice at the bar. "You hear about the fat girl he brought up the mountain? Paid 100 in gold, they say. Must be some kind of debt to the devil to spend that much." Laughter followed, sharp as broken glass. Tobias's jaw clenched. He didn't speak, didn't threaten. He simply finished his purchase, turned, and stared down the room. Silence fell like a blade. Then he left without a word. But the rumors followed him up the mountain like wolves in the dark. A week later, Lenora noticed the change in him. He was quieter than usual, more watchful. He checked the rifle twice each night, made sure the door was barred before dusk. When she asked what was wrong, he said only, "The world remembers things best left buried." One evening, as they shelled beans by the fire, she finally pressed him. "You're hiding something, Tobias. You've been looking over your shoulder like a man expecting ghosts." He didn't look up from the bowl. "There are men in Blackwater who remember what I did before I came here." "What did you do?" His hand stilled. The firelight carved deep lines across his face. "I hunted men." Lenora's breath caught. "You mean you were a bounty hunter," he said. "Before that, a soldier. I spent years killing for pay and calling it justice. I thought it would buy peace. It never did." He met her gaze then, the truth raw in his voice. "When my sister died, I swore I'd never take another life unless I had to. I came here to keep that promise." Lenora reached across the table, resting her hand on his. "And you've kept it?" He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Until the world comes knocking again." It did, sooner than either expected. Two strangers appeared one afternoon, men on horseback, their coats city-cut, their holsters polished. Lenora saw them first from the window. Tobias stepped onto the porch before they even dismounted. "Can I help you?" His voice was flat steel. The taller man tipped his hat. "Name's Briggs. This here's my partner, Doyle. We're agents of the law, Mr. Blackthorne. Heard tell you're harboring a woman who don't belong to you." Lenora froze. Tobias's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "The woman you're talking about makes her own choices. She's free to leave when she wishes." Briggs smiled thinly. "That's not what her mama says." The word mama hit like a shot. Lenora's heart lurched. She stepped onto the porch. "My mother sold me," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "She gave me away for $5. He saved me." Doyle looked uncomfortable. Briggs only smirked. "Lady, the law don't much care for stories like that. Paper says you're a dependent. Your ma's filed complaint of abduction and property theft. Says this man took you and her gold." Tobias's voice dropped low. "You tell your employer if he wants that gold, he can dig through hell to find it." Briggs's smile faded. "Careful, old man. Threatening officers don't end well." Tobias took a step forward, rifle in hand, but barrel lowered. "Neither does lying about the law." The standoff held for a long breath before Doyle muttered, "Briggs, let's go. This ain't worth it." Briggs spat, swung into the saddle. "We'll be back, with a warrant." They rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the trees. Lenora turned to Tobias, eyes wide. "They'll come again." He nodded grimly. "Then we'll be ready." That night, the cabin felt smaller. Tobias sat by the door cleaning his gun. Lenora couldn't sleep. She paced the floor, then stopped. "You could have let them take me," she said. "It would have been easier." He looked up sharply. "Easier for who?" "For you." He shook his head. "I don't take the easy way. Never did. Not when I buried my sister. Not when I found you." Her throat tightened. "Then what will you do if they come back?" "Protect what's mine," he said simply. Something in his tone made her heart stutter. "Yours?" she whispered. He met her gaze, the firelight catching in his eyes. You can leave any time, Lenora, but as long as you stay here, this is your home, and my word is law when it comes to your safety." She stepped closer, her hand trembling. "Then I'll stay." He set the rifle aside, stood, and brushed a stray curl from her face. "Then I'll fight." For a moment, neither moved. The storm outside was only wind, but inside the air was electric with everything they hadn't said. Then Tobias turned away, jaw tight. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start fortifying." They worked through the next day like soldiers preparing for siege. Tobias reinforced the shutters, dug out old traps, and stacked wood high by the hearth. Lenora helped where she could, carrying nails, patching fabric, brewing coffee. The work steadied them, but by nightfall the unease returned. As they ate in silence, she said softly, "You can't keep living in fear of the world." Tobias looked at her across the flickering table. "And you can't keep believing it's done hurting you." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe we're both fools." "Maybe," he said, "but fools still survive if they're stubborn enough." Outside, thunder rumbled again, the same deep growl that had shaken the cabin months before. Only this time, it wasn't storm clouds. It was hoofbeats. Tobias rose, eyes narrowing. "They're here." Lenora stood beside him, heart pounding. "What do we do?" He handed her the lantern. "You stay behind me, and you remember what I said. You're not property. You're not for sale." She nodded, gripping the light with both hands. The hoofbeats grew louder, stopping just beyond the porch. Shadows moved between the trees. Tobias stepped into the doorway, rifle in hand. The night held its breath, and for the second time in her life, Lenora realized that a man was about to fight for her, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The lantern flame flickered as wind swept through the valley. Tobias stood framed in the doorway, rifle steady, eyes fixed on the tree line. Lenora stayed behind him, one hand clutching the lantern, the other pressed against her chest where her heart refused to slow. 3 riders emerged from the shadows, Briggs, Doyle, and another man in a gray overcoat who held a folded paper. "Told you we'd be back," Briggs called. "You got 10 seconds to hand over the girl before this gets ugly." Tobias didn't move. "It's already ugly." Doyle shifted uneasily in his saddle. "Toby, don't make this worse. We just want her to come quietly. No one needs to bleed." Lenora stepped forward before Tobias could speak. Her voice was unsteady, but loud enough to cut the wind. "You think you can take me? You don't even know my name." Briggs sneered. "Name don't matter. Paper says you're Mildred Hargrave's daughter, and that's enough." He waved the document. "Signed and sealed." Tobias's voice dropped low. "I've seen enough false seals to know a bought hand when I smell one." Briggs raised his revolver. "Back off, mountain man." The crack of thunder swallowed the moment. A storm was rolling in from the peaks, lightning flashing against the ridge, wind rising in angry waves. The horses shied and stamped nervously. Tobias didn't flinch. "Put down your gun. Leave now, and no one rides home bleeding." Briggs laughed. "You ain't law anymore, Blackthorn. You're just another hermit with a grudge." "Maybe," Tobias said quietly, "but I've buried worse men than you." The tension snapped. Briggs fired first, a wild shot that splintered the porch post inches from Tobias's shoulder. Tobias answered with one measured pull of the trigger. Briggs's hat flew off as the bullet tore past his ear, grazing flesh. The man yelped and dropped his gun. Doyle cursed and grabbed his reins. "Enough! Briggs, we're leaving!" But the man in the gray coat, the one who hadn't spoken, raised his pistol toward Lenora. "She's the key, you fool!" he shouted. "Grab her!" Lenora didn't think. She hurled the lantern straight at him. It shattered in a burst of fire, oil splashing across the man's coat. He screamed, dropped his weapon, and rolled in the mud. Tobias lunged forward, rifle butt cracking against Briggs's jaw, sending him sprawling. In the chaos, Doyle dragged his partner onto his horse and fled down the trail. The burning man stumbled after them, leaving smoke and curses in his wake. And then there was only the rain. Tobias lowered the rifle, chest heaving. Lenora stood frozen, trembling but upright. The porch smelled of smoke and rainwater. He turned to her slowly. "You all right?" She nodded, though tears streaked her face. "I threw the lantern," she whispered, almost disbelieving. "I didn't even think—" "You didn't need to," he said. "You acted. You saved us both." The storm broke fully then, sheets of rain pouring from the sky. Tobias reached for her hand and pulled her into the shelter of the cabin. The door slammed shut behind them, thunder echoing in the valley below. Inside, the fire had nearly died. He fed it new wood, the flames roaring back to life. Lenora sank to her knees beside the hearth, shaking. Tobias knelt beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. "They won't come back." She looked up at him, mud on her cheek, eyes shining like wet amber. "You can't know that." "No," he admitted, "but I know this. You're not running anymore. You're not hiding. You stood your ground tonight." A tear slipped down her face. "I wasn't brave," she whispered. "Yes, you were," he said, voice rough. "Bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about standing anyway." For a long moment, neither spoke. The firelight danced between them, painting gold across the scars on his hands and the soft curves of her face. Finally, Lenora said, "You risked your life for me." Tobias shook his head. "No, I lived for the first time in years because of you." Outside, the storm rolled on, but inside, the cabin glowed warm, alive, and defiant. Two souls who had once belonged to no one now belonged fiercely to each other. The storm passed before dawn. The mountains were washed clean, every branch dripping with silver light. Mist curled along the valley floor like smoke from a sleeping fire. Lenora woke to birdsong and the faint smell of coffee. Tobias was outside, standing barefoot on the porch, steam rising from his mug. The rifle leaned forgotten against the wall. For the first time since she had known him, his shoulders were at rest. She stepped quietly to his side. He didn't turn, but his voice softened. "You sleep at all?" "A little," she said. "You?" He smiled faintly. "Didn't need to. The world's quiet again." They stood together, watching the valley wake. Sunlight crept over the peaks, touching the roof, the fence, the young sprouts in her garden. It felt like the mountains themselves were breathing easier. After a while, Lenora spoke. "What happens now?" Tobias took a long breath. "We keep living. That's all anyone can do." He turned toward her, his eyes steady and unguarded. "Unless you'd rather go south when the trail clears, you could have a house in town, a life with people who—" She shook her head before he could finish. "I don't want a house in town. I want this." She gestured to the cabin, the valley, and then, hesitantly, to him. "I want you." For a moment, neither moved. Then Tobias set his mug aside, stepped closer, and touched her cheek as if asking permission. "Lenora," he whispered, "you don't owe me anything." She met his gaze. I know. That's why I can love you. Something in him broke open then, a quiet surrender, years in the making. He leaned down, and their foreheads met. The kiss that followed wasn't hurried or desperate. It was calm, certain, and full of the life they'd both fought to earn. When they finally pulled apart, Tobias laughed softly, the sound of a man remembering joy. You know, he said, I never thought the mountains could hold more than silence. Lenora smiled through her tears. Maybe they were waiting for someone to listen. They sat together on the porch steps as the morning stretched on, watching sunlight turn the mist into gold. Down in the valley, the river sang its endless song, carrying away the ashes of everything that had tried to break them. Inside the cabin, the fire still glowed. 2 cups of coffee waited on the table, one black and strong, one sweetened with honey. For once, there was no fear of footsteps, no dread of doors opening, only peace, steady as a heartbeat. Tobias reached for her hand, rough fingers closing around hers. You're safe here, he said quietly. Lenora rested her head against his shoulder. Home, she murmured, at last. The wind moved through the pines like a hymn, and the mountains stood witness. 2 souls, once discarded, finding grace in each other's keeping. Every time I share a story like this, I'm reminded that love isn't born in comfort. It's forged in the cold, in the moments when the world turns cruel and someone still chooses kindness. Tobias and Lenora's story isn't just about rescue. It's about redemption, proof that even those cast aside by the world can build a home out of hope. If you've ever been told you're not enough, let this story be your reminder. You are. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your next story is already waiting.